Alright, so I've been wanting to establish a bit of a background for a while now, which we can refer back to before we can actually deal with some of the more advanced stuff. And I think a crucial part of that is religion. Each one of Japan's major religions and philosophies is going to get its own video, and sooner or later, there's going to be more videos on specific aspects too. And I'll probably do at least one video focusing on the interplay between the different religions and philosophies eventually. Point is, today we are talking about Shintoism. So what is Shinto? I'm not being cute here. Okay, I am. I just can't help it. But there's actually disagreement on this point. It might seem obvious that Shinto is a religion, but things aren't quite so cut and dry. There are several complicating factors here. For one, many Japanese people, even those that identify as Shintoites, claim that they aren't religious. At the same time, the vast majority of them also list Buddhism among their beliefs. This makes it easy to declare Shintoism to be something else, not a religion in its own right, but something different. And indeed, even the Japanese government classified large parts of Shinto as non-religious in the past. What's more, many Japanese people have difficulties articulating their religiosity in regards to Shinto. They may be unaware which god is enshrined in the shrine they are visiting, even if they are going daily, and they may be unable to say what they are praying for or why. What's more, Shinto doesn't have a founder, any holy writings, or even a unifying, clearly defined doctrine. All points associated with proper big boy religions. Seeing all this, an argument can be made that Shinto is nothing more than a collection of rituals, no faith necessary. And indeed, people have struggled with this, some arguing that for Shinto, practice is belief, thereby implying that there is no faith and evidence other than through action. But I don't think that we should jump to conclusions like this, as each of these arguments has another side to it. Let's go through them one by one. Why do many people who say they are Shintoites also say they are non-religious? Maybe the question should be if they did. See, the term religion doesn't have the same universal definition across the world. The term used in the surveys in question is shūkyō, which is a word that originally used to refer to specific subsects of Buddhism. It has connotations of a very specific doctrinal faith as opposed to everyday undogmatic practice. That sort of definition is one that people, even believers, would be uneasy to identify with. But why would a Shintoite list Buddhism too if they were committed to Shintoism? The thing is that Buddhism has entered into a sort of syncretism with Shintoism, where the complementing parts of both religions supplement each other. For example, while Shinto is a faith that deals really well with life, it has a taboo about everything unclean and dead. Don't worry, we'll get into that later. Buddhism, meanwhile, is really good at dealing with all things post-living. So the two have found a way to coexist, even within the same believer, by focusing on the aspects they revolved around to begin with, and leaving less fundamental aspects to the other religion. But does it have to be impossible to have two religions in the first place? Sure, the Christian god is a bit of a diva, not wanting to share the limelight and all, but even within Christianity we can find examples of parts of other religions. A lot of these are boring theology stuff. Just Google Christianity syncretism if you want to know more or if you have trouble falling asleep. But take the Christmas tree for example. Evergreens were a symbol for immortality long before Jesus' carpentry became involuntary. And that, originally pagan, belief is most likely the origin of the Christmas tree. This is even more apparent in polytheistic religions, where gods get traded back and forth like Pokemons. And some cultures, like the Romans, even went out of their way to find gods that paralleled their own in cultures they encountered. This smoothed over some of the conflict between the religions, especially in the case of cultures they conquered. And there are several examples of peoples who, when they were made to swear they'd convert to Christianity, simply started worshipping the Christian god as well. But back to Shintoism. If all of the above is true, why has Shintoism been classified as non-religious by the government? Well, it hasn't. Only parts of it have. What's more, there was basically just a huge political hat trick. After the shogunate was overthrown, the Meiji government tried to establish a new, Western-style government to emulate the political and military power of the European-style nation-state. In order to bolster a nationalist movement, the state ordered the separation of Shintoism and Buddhism. The latter was considered a foreign influence, despite what had been over 1,000 years of syncretism at that point. It also declared some of the larger movements within Shinto as sect Shinto, turning them into separate religious denominations that people were allowed to follow under the new, imported freedom of religion. In turn, the state was no longer allowed to finance religions either. Handily, they had only separated out the larger groups. Most shrines were not affiliated with any of them. and it was especially those shrines that were facing a sort of crisis of, not faith exactly, but of legitimization. Since the philosophical basis of most shrines was closely tied to the intellectual framework provided by the Buddhists they had been recently disassociated from, they needed to re-establish a lot of the theology, large parts of which had been taken whole cloth from Buddhism. That meant that there was room to establish some doctrine. So the state did. It clustered the unassociated shrines under the category of Shrine Shinto and provided them with a philosophy that rationalized imperial rule, thus using the network of shrines to propagandize. And since Shrine Shinto, unlike Sect Shinto, definitely wasn't a religion if you know what I'm saying, nudge nudge wink wink, the state could freely finance Shrine Shinto without violating the law that prevented it from financing religious institutes. This effectively tied the majority of the shrines to the government in order to bolster its own influence. So essentially, this was a scheme to disempower Buddhism and empower the nationalists, ultimately legitimizing the emperor. Calling Shrine Shinto non-religious was a political move, not an honest assessment of any quality inherent to, or indeed lacking from, Shinto. That leaves us with the strange inability of Japanese people to articulate the motivation behind their religious practice. First of all, the example of the Shintoist not knowing which deity is enshrined at their local shrine. That seems strange, since the deity is who's being venerated here. But to take an example from Christianity, does every Christian know who the patron saint of the local church is? Beyond the name, I only know the saints of the two closest churches, and that only because they are named after them. One of them is famous, so I know that one, but I couldn't even tell you what the other one did. Sure, I may not be a believer, but I did go to church a couple of times. I went through the rituals. Does not knowing some factoid like that exclude you from faith? Surely not. But then, why do Shintoists seem to struggle to put their faith into words? Surely if you pray, you have to know what for. If you don't, you're just following a routine, aren't you? Here, like with the multiple religions, the issue might be one of perspective. Does one have to have a clearly defined motivation for an action for that action to be one of faith? In Christianity, for example, one is expected to pray for something. I've certainly come across a claim that prayer and or faith in the big G, as I believe the clergy likes to call him, will pretty much guarantee the prayed for results, at least if you believe hard enough. But is that conceptualization of prayer a necessity for something to be called a religion? Could we interpret, for example, a shrine visit as an action of faith in and of itself? If we think of the prayer at the shrine as an act of paying respect, this dichotomy is put into stark contrast. While the question, what are you praying for, sounds to Western ears meaningful and natural, the question, what are you paying respect for, would be a hard question to answer succinctly. The only obvious answer is a circular argument. You pay respect because you have respect and you want to pay. Do you have to do it to achieve something? Maybe prayer can be a form of paying respect. And even if it can't, can you only pray if you want something in return? If that's the case, does that mean that Christians who go to church on a Sunday basis are sometimes unable to pray if they can't think of anything to pray for this week? And we can repeat the same line of reasoning innumerable times with slightly different phrasing. For example, if we consider prayer a form of worship instead of a form of paying respect. To give another example, if you were to ask someone who wears a cross around their neck why they put it on, would they be able to tell you? They might tell you why they wear it in general terms, but why did they decide to put it on today? Would they be able to say what they were trying to achieve with it? I don't think so, certainly not everyone. But even if they can't, wouldn't putting it on still be an act of faith? We also have to remember that this Shintoist inability to say what you prayed for is not universal, as there are times and occasions when Shintoists know exactly what they are praying for. It's only in the everyday showing of faith that articulating a reason may be difficult. And why would a founder be necessary or holy writings? True, Buddhism has both, as do most religions that developed from Judaism, which means the most popular ones today do, but most religions throughout history managed without either. Astaro, that's the Norse religion, the one with Thor and so on, so hard didn't have any holy writings that the earliest sources we do have are influenced by Christianity to the degree that we have difficulty telling what the original faith of its practitioners might have looked like. And the same is true for any number of religions. Similarly, there is no founder to countless religions, but is Astaro or ancient Greek or Mayan faith any less for not having a founder? As for doctrine, in lieu of making the same argument a third time, one look at the history of Christianity should tell us that doctrine is in no way binding. So why should doctrine be the defining factor if it is malleable and can even lead to a split in the religion? At the same time, just because there's no formal doctrine doesn't mean that there isn't a set of common beliefs that's inherent to the religion. On closer inspection, most of the arguments against the religiosity of Shinto, its overlap with Buddhism, the vagueness of some of the believers' motivations, the non-existence of a founder, holy text or doctrine, all stem from the central fact that Shintoism doesn't have a centralized organization. It is in the truest sense a folk belief, one that is so deeply ingrained in its culture that it's difficult, maybe impossible, to separate it, which adds to the difficulty in defining it. For many Western observers, who are exposed to the strictly doctrinal religions like Christianity that dominate in the West, this absence seemed like a lack, but in actuality it might just as well be a strength. Shinto is a natural part of Japanese life, its worldview ever present to the point where it doesn't need to be put into words, dogmas, or linked to any singular source to be legitimized, because it is legitimate. In conclusion, if we approach Shinto with a narrowly defined concept of religion that is based on the Abrahamic religions we are used to in the West, it may be possible to come to the impression that Shinto is not a religion at all. But if we question some of the assumptions that view of religion presupposes, it becomes clear that Shintoism is indeed a religion which goes well beyond the mere faithless adherence to ritual that it's sometimes seen as. So, now we've established well and proper that Shinto is a religion, and so quickly too. But what is it about? Okay, before we get into this, I'd like to ask you to remember that there is no central authority on Shinto. I literally cannot give one definition of Shinto that everyone or even most people will agree with. Faith is a personal matter, and Shinto expressly so. What I'm giving here is a description that reflects my view on Shinto, which is informed by the sources, most significantly Shinto The Way Home, which was the most neutral and in-depth source I could get my grubby little paws on, but it also reflects what I learned in my conversations with Japanese people. It should also go without saying that, in my research, I rejected some sources wholesale when I felt that they were informed by some of the wrong-headed arguments we discussed before. But back on topic, let's start by looking at the kanji Shinto is written with. Shinto. Shin and To. It's easiest to work backwards in this case. To literally translates as road, but in this context, way has some more helpful connotations. That's because in many cases, To denotes a practice or method. Most famously Judo, which translates as the peaceful way, Sado, the way of tea, Shodo, the way of writing, and so on. This is similar to the Kyo in Shu-Kyo, the term for religion we discussed before. That Kyo can be translated the same, but it has a connotation of more high-minded theory, while To actually refers to something practiced and tangible. So what is Shinto the way of? Let's have a look at that first kanji. Shin means kami, a word that is usually translated as gods. But in the West, we have a very specific view of what gods are, and the kami don't quite fit that Western definition. Sure, they are powerful beings, and some of them participated in the creation myth and legitimized the emperor, like you do when you are a self-respecting deity, and it makes sense to pray to them and make offerings, but that's where the similarities end. For one, while angering the gods is a bad idea that can cause droughts and so on, and appeasing them can make the bad thing go away, there is a surprising lack of stories where the kami mess with humans. Sure, sometimes they fight and their actions might have an effect on humans, like when Amaterasu, the sun kami, gets offended and hides in a rock. An action that bathes the world in darkness, but that's a side effect. Kami don't set out to screw with humans, it just happens sometimes. You wouldn't find a Japanese Odysseus, for example. Many kami are also personifications of natural features, like the sun or Mount Fuji. In fact, there's a positive surplus of kami in Shinto belief. While there's a limited number of kami that people know by name, the total is universally agreed to be much larger. Countless is the actual number here. Kami are found everywhere in nature, which is why you will find striking features venerated at shrines, rocks, waterfalls and trees being the most common. This is also why you will find many yokai, mythical creatures of Shintoism and Japanese folk belief, that are directly related to natural features, like the Furutsubaki no Rei, which is the spirit of an old tree, or even animals like kitsune or Tanukis. Wait a minute, I hear you say, because yes, I can hear you. Yokai are mythical creatures, they've got nothing to do with kami. Well, this is where we get into the most significant difference between kami and gods. Kami as a category are permeable. First of all, the border between yokai and kami is fluent to the degree where some sources define yokai as malicious kami and kami as venerated yokai. And that should ring a bell for anyone, because different forms of ghosts can be considered yokai as well. Does that mean ghosts can become kami? It does. In case that wasn't clear enough. Human beings, that's you lot, can become kami. There is something similar in other religions, but there's a crucial difference here. The Greek gods, for example, may choose to honor and elevate you. That's where we get the word apotheosis from, but that's only if they take a liking to you. Most of the time, that means you are either a great hero or willing to marry your way up to the Mount Olympus. But usually, if you even compare yourself with a god, they will take that quite badly. Just think of Arachne or anyone who dares to say they're feeling pretty today within earshot of Aphrodite. Besides the handful of people the gods chose to elevate through direct intervention, most of the people who set out to become a god get punished with increasing creativity. But in Shinto, not only is it possible for humans to become kami without divine intervention, it has happened with historical documentation. The most famous example for this is the god Tenjin. In his human life, the kami, subsequently known as Tenjin, was a court official in the late 9th and early 10th century under the name Sugawara no Michizane, and he was a famous scholar and poet. At the time, the Fujiwara clan, which he wasn't a part of, had a powerful position in court. By marrying their daughters to the emperor and monopolizing key region positions, namely the Seisho and Kampaku, they had become the de facto rulers of Japan. Sugawara no Michizane spoke up in favor of the emperor, which meant he spoke up in favor of censoring Fujiwara no Mototsune, who invented the position of Kampaku in order to maintain his power when the emperor came of age. This way, Sugawara no Michizane set himself in opposition to the Fujiwara clan. This earned him a few promotions in an attempt by Emperor Uda to re-establish the power of the imperial household. After the abdication of Emperor Uda, however, Sugawara no Michizane was in a precarious position. In the year 901, he was accused of favoring Prince Kyoto over the crown prince. As a result, he was demoted and relocated to Kyushu, effectively banished. He died in 903 after only 2 years of exile. So far so tragic. But after his death, plague and drought and floods suddenly befell the capital, the imperial palace's audience hall was struck by lightning multiple times, and several of Emperor Daigo's sons died. All of these disasters were attributed to the vengeful spirit of Sugawara no Michizane. So to appease him, his title and office were reinstated, and his exile was excised from the official record. Furthermore, a shrine was built in his honor, where he would be worshipped under the name of Tenjin-sama. First he was seen, as you may imagine, as a god of disasters, and worshipping him was done mainly in an attempt to prevent further tragedy. However, his artistic side was what would, over the course of several centuries, become the predominant aspect of his worship, and since the Edo period he has been regarded as a patron of scholarship and education. To this day, students and their parents flock to Tenjin shrines, which dot the country by now, to pray for success before important exams. This is one example, by the way, where Shintoists would have no trouble telling you what they are praying for. But that's how we got the kami Tenjin. There was no divine intervention, no god deciding it would be neat to have him around or any of that. Tenjin became a god out of his own power. He was wronged, wanted to set things right, and laid waste to the empire until he did. The other kami weren't even necessary. No account I came across even mentioned that Sugawara no Michizane set out to become a kami. The only major player even said to have anything directly to do with the kami is Emperor Daigo, who gave Tenjin his name and ordered the shrines to be built. The emperor is supposed to be a descendant of the kami, but even he was cajoled into compliance. You try that with Zeus and you're gonna end up dead. Or pregnant. Okay, just a bit of clarification before we get into this. We're heading into a complex but fundamental topic, and there are several related words. That would be mi, mono, and tama. They serve largely the same function, and the distinction has fallen somewhat out of use. So instead of getting into precise, complicated, and overlapping definitions, I'm going to use the word tama as a catch-all here. Just be aware that this is the simplified version of this talk, and that there is more depth to be found even in the very vocabulary. Tama is an invisible life force, a concept similar to the Chinese Qi, which is allegedly the inspiration for the Force of Star Wars fame. Everything, even words and some abstract concept, are possessed of Tama. Thinking of Tama as a soul can be helpful, but only to a degree. Tama is an animating and sentience imbuing force that takes residence in everything. It changes and grows over time, which is the reason that you will find many yokai that are significantly linked with old age, like the Bakeneko, which develop when a regular cat turns 100, or Tsukumogami, which are regular household objects that come alive when they are 100 years old. This ever-presence of Tama has a profound effect with implications on the whole of the Shinto faith. And indeed, some forms of Tama go beyond the spiritual and give rise to the material as well. We already touched on how Tama blurs the line between kami and yokai and allows even humans to cross into these categories, but it goes beyond that. Tama is a force that animates us, which means not only that everything has a capability to be imbued with a soul, it also enables us to find the soul in everything, allowing for a sort of holistic compassion towards the world. In fact, the aforementioned multitude of kami stems from this, as absolutely everything is possessed of Tama, and kami are beings of Tama, there can be kami in absolutely everything. This, I think, is the ultimate core of Shinto. In pretty much every conversation I've had on the topic, the fact that kami reside in everything came up, and Tama is the underlying explanation and mechanism facilitating that. As the animating, unifying force of the world, it underlies everything in the Shinto faith. Interestingly though, many of the sources I came across did not mention Tama at all. How can that be if Tama is so important? I want you to be aware that I could simply handwave this by saying, nothing to see here, no universal doctrine, and leave it at that. But that would be easy, and why would I ever make my life easy? Instead, I think this is a case where the theoretical explanation is something that is simply irrelevant for many of the faithful. Think about it. People, for the most part, don't interact with Tama directly, only with the things that Tama gives rise to, like kami, the soul, or whatever else it may be. To put it another way, the sentences "there are kami in everything" and "because of Tama, there are kami in everything" have the same implications for the end user. So unless you really dig into the theory part of everything, you can get by without Tama having to matter at all. For a Christian example of a similar blind spot, look at the Trinity. I'm sure everyone knows who the Son is, but I'm just as sure a great many Christians would have trouble explaining the difference between those other two guys. Sure, the Trinity is important, at least it gets mentioned a lot, could be a contractual thing, but the important dynamic is that between Jesus and his Sky Daddy, and you can understand that even without the Trinity. The reason why I think Tama should be mentioned regardless is that Tama does more than just animate. It is also what gives kami and yokai, and humans with ambitions to become either, their power, and as the basis of the soul, it also explains some of the things that happen to the soul after death. So Tama is everywhere, and it is the basis of the soul and of kami and other things that are venerated in Shinto. Does that mean everything should be worshipped? Yes, but also no. The awareness of Tama and its interrelationship with the world is supposed to put you in awe, to awaken a sort of mindfulness towards the world. In Japanese, this awareness of the interconnectedness of things, and especially one's own role in that interplay, is called Makoto no Kokoro, which translates as mindful heart. Heart, in this case, is more complex than one might assume. It has a physical component to it and is more comparable maybe to the heart in the phrase "the heart of the matter" than to the purely emotional one might assume in English. The mindfulness of Makoto no Kokoro is necessary not only for understanding the universe and one's own place in it, it also makes you receptive to the awesome nature of the world around you. But Shintoism is under no illusion that this is something that comes easily or naturally in our daily lives. This is where the idea of a holographic entry point comes into play. A holographic entry point is something like a physical metaphor that helps make you aware of the awesome nature of nature around you. At the same time, it's part of the whole that it reflects. The most obvious example for the holographic entry point is the Tori, a literal entry point to the shrine, which is the religious building of Shinto. Think church, but Japanese, but also barely like a church. For this context, just remember that this is the house where Shinto lives, and what signifies the entrance to the shrine is the Tori, a big, freestanding, often red gate, which is usually shaped something like this. This rule is not absolute because, well, nothing in Shinto is. Point is, the vast majority of shrines have a Tori, if not several ones, and it's the place you enter the shrine grounds from. So it's a literal entry point. How is it holographic? Well, with its positioning at the border of the shrine grounds, the Tori delineates a differentiation between the shrine grounds and the outside world. What's crucial here is that this delineation is A, symbolized by the Tori, and B, not dependent on the Tori. The shrine and its environs are sacred, and they would be even if the Tori didn't exist. The Tori is simply built in recognition of that fact, a way to bring that fact to the mind of the observer, but not the cause of that fact. This is why the Tori is freestanding and not connected to a wall. You are entering into the sacred shrine grounds whether you walk through the Tori or around it. The sacred is there, the Tori simply acknowledges it. That is why most shrines are surrounded by nature. They too are a holographic entry point, even though they serve other functions as well. But they too are built in acknowledgement of nature, the, well, natural extension of the Tama, which is why you find an abundance of holographic entry points in Japan. You can find ropes around significant rocks or trees almost anywhere in Japan. Shrines built on mountaintops, around particularly scenic views, or in caves, on tiny islands and around waterfalls, the ocean and other natural features. Remember, none of these create the significance of these natural features, they are a reaction to that significance. One could argue that, by emphasizing the magnitude of the object of worship, they enhance it in the mind of the worshipper. But they do not create it out of nothing. In fact, even these sites, impressive though they are also a holographic entry point in and of themselves. They are a part of nature that exemplifies the beauty and awe of all nature. And with that, we have reached the next important aspect of Shintoism. Besides being an animistic religion, what with the Tama and such, Shinto is also a religion that venerates nature specifically. Again, Tama is the most convenient explanation for this. Since Tama is a life-giving force, all life is imbued with and originates from Tama, which means so is all of nature. This highlighting of natural features by way of holographic entry point is a way to express that striking features and indeed feats are connected to the use of Tama. Where nature is most beautiful, where the most ancient trees grow, the strangest rocks lie, where the most breathtaking vistas are to be seen, there Tama is strongest. And this is self-evident, as nature puts us in awe of itself as a natural reaction to the awesome power of Tama. This awe too can be seen as a basis of Shinto. Relating to this, it is important to note that Tama is not something that can be disseminated. It cannot be understood fully. It is and is meant to be a mysterious force that we can only grasp in its outlines. To even try to fully understand it would be to fail to do so. It is in its very nature a mystery, a wonder that cannot be understood any more than nature can be understood in its fullness. Some of you may say, no, wait a minute! If we cannot understand nature, what are we paying biologists for? But you would be missing the point. You can study, to grab a random example off the top of my head, tanukis. You can research what kind of animals they are, if they are nocturnal or nocturnal, what they eat, where they live and so on. But that brings up new questions. Why do they behave in those ways? How did they develop these behaviors and when? Did Tanuki come from the mainland at some point in the past, and how much did they change from those predecessors? Did they replace some other animal that occupied their evolutionary niche, or did they find one of their own? Which brings yet more questions, whether their behaviors changed over time and what causes them now. Are they physical reactions in their cells or psychology? And is there a difference? How do their cells work? What is the powerhouse of the cell? How come the structures that make up those cells work the way they do, and how did they develop? You can find any number of answers to any number of questions, but you will never run out of questions. And that is just about one animal. Imagine even trying to understand the entirety of nature. And Tama is the same. You can ask and answer questions all your life, but you will never reach the end of your questions. The more you know, the more there is to learn. Shintoism is a mystery cult where the mystery is an open secret. But Shinto has a practical side as well. As an extension of its nature worship, there's a plethora of rituals that relate to nature, most notably the seasonal festivals, most of which relate directly to the time of year by incorporating plants and produce. Like Tanabata with bamboo, Obon with beans, or the variety of rituals incorporating rice and or sake. Others are directly linked to something that is specific to a season, like Tsukimi with the autumn moon, Hinamatsuri, which is linked to the blossoming of plum trees, or Hanami with cherry blossoms. There are countless rituals that relate directly to the harvest too, since that is always an important factor in pre-modern cultures and tends to be preserved in religious rites. This importance is, for example, seen in the popularity of Inari shrines around Japan. Inari is a kami you might know from her white foxes, which are, at various times, her messengers, guardians to her shrines, or incantations of the kami herself. But they are not what her actual deific domain is. In actuality, Inari is a kami of the harvest, and since everybody likes a good not starving to death, her shrines are absolutely everywhere, despite foxes being otherwise portrayed as antagonistic. But since we're already talking about kami, let's have a look at some of the famous ones. There's too many kami and too many stories to deal with all of that here, so I'll just go over some of the main players. We already had Inari and Tenjin, harvest and education respectively. But there are other important ones. There's Amaterasu, the single most important kami. She is the sun kami and progenitor of the Tenno. The rationale for her central role varies. In some stories she is put explicitly in charge of the world, in others she sort of put herself in charge by replacing the kami that ruled before her. She later put her human descendants in charge and gave them the 3 imperial regalia as a sign of their right to rule. Another famous kami is Ebisu, the most famous of the 7 gods of fortune, specifically a god of fishermen. Since fishing is an important thing on islands, he was and is widely worshipped, featuring on a lot of art as the logo of Yebisu beer and is a popular face for kagura and no masks, both decorative and in place. I've also seen him on a roof tile. There you go. Another kami, or rather pair of kami, who are very frequently depicted are Fujin and Laijin, the gods of wind and lightning respectively. Ironically, both of them are on the less pretty side of the mirror, but you can tell them apart by their implements and names. The god of wind is Fujin, which you can remember because it sounds like you are blowing wind. Fujin. And he carries a bag full of winds too. Laijin is a god of lightning, which sounds sort of similar if you mumble a bit. Laijin, lightning, you get what I mean. He carries hammers with which he strikes the taiko drums that surround him. But again, this is just a tiny collection of some of the best known kami, which in turn is only a tiny collection out of the mass of named kami, which is even smaller in comparison to the endless hordes of unnamed kami. I will point out though that I noticed that all of them have a direct connection to nature. That isn't the case for every kami, but I didn't go looking for gods that have that connection either. While the lore around the kami helps explain the hierarchy and the genesis of the world, they're not necessary for your everyday prayer and or worship. But how do you behave at a shrine? This will just be a quick rundown, and please remember that with the general fluidity of Shinto, a lot of these rituals are optional. As a general rule, they become more common the closer you get to the shrine building itself. Your shrine visit starts with entering through the tori. You bow once before entering with the left foot. This tradition in particular, and its counterpart upon leaving the shrine, are on the more optional side of things. You'll find a lot of Japanese people who don't do this, or at least don't always do. You are supposed to walk on the side of the road, especially if it has a notably different surface than the center. That's because the middle of the road is reserved for the kami. Again, this is something a lot of people might not even be aware of. Pretty soon you come upon the temizuya, a basin filled with fresh water and often with a bamboo construction above it. It also has at least one large ladle, this too often made from bamboo, which is used for the ritualistic cleaning. You take up the ladle on the right and scoop up some water. Pour some over the left hand to clean it, switch hands and pour water over the right hand. Switch hands again and pour some more water into your cupped left hand to rinse your mouth with. Depending on how much you trust the water, and in some of the more frequented shrines I probably wouldn't, you can literally put some in your mouth and spit it out. Or you can just symbolically wash your mouth, raising the water to your lips. Under no circumstances should you put your lips directly on the label. Finally, you pour whatever rest water you have in the ladle over the handle by raising it upright and return it for the next user. Ideally, you do this without filling the ladle in between, which really isn't a problem if you're a bit careful. This isn't a clinical cleansing after all, it's a symbolic one. Finally, you will approach the shrine itself. There's a box with a slatted top, which is for donations. The most common donation is 5 yen, because the Japanese term go-en sounds like goen, which means destiny. But you can offer however much or little you like. If the shrine has a bell, this is when you would ring it. Then you bow twice, clap twice, and keep your hands together as now, having drawn the attention of the kami, you pray. When you are done with your prayer, which may be immediately, you bow again and make place for other worshippers when and where available. Upon leaving, you bow once towards the shrine at the tori, but as we're getting further away from the shrine again, this too is something not everybody does. Now, if you think on the rituals here, there's one that stands out a bit, doesn't it? There's a lot of bowing to pay respect to, and some making noise to get the attention of the kami surrounding the shrine and the prayer, which all fits together, but what does the cleaning have to do with anything? Well, it's actually an expression of another central Shinto belief, which I didn't know how to put anywhere else. This central, and certainly not added to the end bit of the script, part of Shinto belief, is reflected in many ways. Apart from the cleaning that comes with every shrine visit, there are other shrine rituals relating to purification. The bell you ring is supposed to drive out spirits and have a purifying effect. So is the manifold use of paper, pun intended, salt, water, tree branches and sake in and around shrines, and there are several festivals where you're supposed to be abstinent for a time if you participate in certain ways. But where does this idea stem from? Ancient times actually. Some of the earliest sources we have on Shinto indicate that purity was a precept even in prehistoric times. What with Shinto being concerned first and foremost with life, there's a natural stigma and, subsequently, taboo connected to everything that relates to death. Very specifically bodily fluids and blood most of all. But with just a bit of abstraction you can apply this to all kinds of impurity. But the aversion to death and blood is the strongest. Butchers and other jobs that worked on and with dead animals, and indeed people, were shunned by ancient Japanese society. And even now, similar stigma exists. For example, you are not supposed to enter a shrine in the period of mourning after the death of someone close to you. But the aversion to blood, even when it was arguably quite the opposite of being connected to death, is quite strong too. Since women, unfortunately, bleed during childbirth, they were considered unclean in the period after a birth. So much so that they were not allowed to attend their child's first shrine visit, a taboo that is being thankfully forgotten in many places. I should note, because it just makes me so happy, that it appears that it isn't the priests who've forgotten this so much as it is the young mothers who forget, with some emphasis. The importance of purification also plays a role in the selection of many of the offerings, paraphernalia and symbols of Shinto. The color white is an important color, being a color of purity in many cultures around the world. Rice, which has to be dried and polished to make it clear white, is important, as is sake, which is made by purifying that rice even further. Salt, which in Japan was usually made from seawater, plays an important role too, as does water itself, and paper, which is formed from tree fibers, in yet another process that can be seen as a form of purification. There's a bit of wordplay going on here, by the way, as the word for paper is kami, making it a homonym with the word for kami, which is kami. But with this focus on purity stemming ultimately from an aversion to death, what does the Shinto conceptualization of death look like? There's actually no clear answer to this, at least not a single one. Some people say that Shinto has no concept of the afterlife, which isn't taken from Buddhist syncretism, but while it is true that Buddhism has been left in charge of the afterlife in that relationship, that doesn't mean that Shinto doesn't have its own image of the great beyond. It does, and it's one that is quite distinct indeed. Another common, if not entirely accurate response, and one that I've heard from Japanese people too, is that the afterlife takes place in Yomi or Yomi no Kuni. The name translates to the land of darkness, which is portrayed as a dark, unclean place where the dead dwell in perpetuity. If you eat the food of the land of the dead, you cannot return from there. While it is not an explicit hell where the dead are punished, it is certainly an unpleasant place, just not one designed to punish you for your misdeeds. It's more of a fact of, well, not life, but you know, death. The problem with this is that Yomi no Kuni isn't as central to Shintoism as you would expect of an afterlife. In fact, there's only one famous story about it, which takes place in the Age of Myths, long before humans, and, indeed, is the premythary of the creation of the sun kami Amaterasu. As part of that tale, the entrance/exit to Yomi no Kuni is sealed, which, right, if you can't get in or out, I can see why there aren't many other stories taking place there. Fair enough, but we don't have a terrible amount of sources on Yomi no Kuni. The primary ones are the Nihonshiki and the Kojiki, two ancient books that are among the oldest and most important sources on Shinto, but that's still just the one story. But while that is one afterlife of Shinto, it is by no means the only one. In fact, there are several possible versions of what might happen to you after death. There are yurei, which is to say, ghosts, so wandering the earth in search of revenge is always an option if you're up for that sort of thing. These ghosts work similarly to their European cousins in that you don't automatically become one. Something, normally a bad something, has to keep you here. You might think that this is what happened to Tenjin, but that's not necessarily true. The tales around his death don't feature him appearing in person, at least not in a major way. We only see the result of his workings. Since he became a kami, he couldn't have gone to Yomi no Kuni either, because remember, you're not supposed to get out of there. So, while he might not have been a ghost, his soul was clearly still engaged in the mortal realms. Well, this is where Tama make their way back into the conversation. Upon death, the Tama that makes up your soul leaves your body, not becoming a ghost, but not departing the world either. This soul continues after death, being an independent actor for 33 years before it becomes part of a more diffused corporate ancestor. That is not the sort of family you claim to get tax breaks. Instead, it is a sort of fused collective of spirits which are the protectors of a family or even country. In this way, most souls become a sort of kami, being elevated from humanity and empowered by the collective they become a part of. But at the same time, less individualized than before. Whether you call that a ghost or not is up to you. I would define it more as a spirit that eventually diffuses into its own ancestry. These spirits never completely disappear into the corporate. They can still be individually prayed for or contacted by spiritualists. They, and the more recently deceased, are also the spirits that feature in the Obon festival, when the spirits are said to return to their family's household shrine. Note that this view of the afterlife is incompatible with the idea of Yomi no Kuni, from which there is no return, and both are incompatible with the cycle of rebirth that forms the basis of Buddhism. That is because they both result in a permanent state from which there is no rebirth, and both without the need to reach enlightenment first. So, looking back on this brief overview on Shintoism, we have established well and truly that it is a religion, one of kami and life and purity, but ultimately of Tama, which is the very foundation of everything, living or not. It is the source of life itself, of the soul, even of matter. It is a mystery that can be approached and contemplated but never fully understood. At the same time, it is everywhere, most readily observed in nature, where its awesome power is most easily realized. A process which is helped by the holographic entry points like the Toli or indeed the very landscape, which can open the mind to the all-encompassing beauty of nature and kami and Tama. To approach this understanding is to follow the way of the kami, and that is Shinto.